So as the war was winding down, of course, the war ended in 1945, but in 1944, there was something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Seeing that the war was ending and that the Allies in the United States were going to win this war, the United States was in a strong position to negotiate. And what we said at the Bretton Woods Agreement was, unless you've been living in a cave for the last several years, you've probably noticed that we have growing economic problems, growing political problems, growing societal and cultural problems. And as I have been diving into these things, trying to figure out their root causes, what is the source? What is the cause of our economic problems, our political problems, our societal and social problems? I did find a common cause, a root. And that root is, believe it or not, central banking. So money is the foundation of society. You cannot have a society without money. And if a society is built on bad money, everything suffers. Okay. The economy suffers. Politics gets corrupted. Okay. And cultural decay happens. All of these things happen as a result of a bad foundation. But if a society is built on sound money, on good money, then a lot of the incentives align to just fix things. And having fixing our money cannot fix everything, but if we could fix our money, it would fix 90% of our problems. I believe 90% of our problems would go away if we got rid of central banking. So how did we get here? How did we get central banking? You know, our founding fathers, including Thomas Jefferson, warned us against central banking. So how do we get here? Well, just to give a little bit of history, um, the Central Bank of the United States was created in 1913. So 1913 was a particularly bad year. That is when the Federal Reserve Act was passed, and we created the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States. Also, the income tax the same year was created in 1913, and it's not a coincidence that both of those things happened in the same year. So in 1913, we had central bank, the Federal Reserve. Also, not coincidentally, the year after that, 1914, started World War I. But maybe I'll come back to that later. But okay, but how did even banking get started? You know, somebody stood up and said, I'm forming a bank and I'll be your banker. When did that happen? Why did that happen? And you know, what is money? And when did people start using money? Well, as far as we know, people have always used money, and we've used different things as money. For example, salt was once used as money. The Latin word for salt is sal, and that's where we get our word salary, because we used to use salt as money. We've tried using seashells as money, and it turns out that those were kind of bad. And what does it take to be good money? Well, it turns out that metals to be pretty decent, things like silver and gold and copper and nickel, these metals turned out to be pretty good money because they're relatively scarce and they're durable. So that those are a couple of features that are needed for good money: scarcity and durability. So people used these monetary metals, things like gold and silver, for a long time. But monetary metals, have some flaws, and what I think are fatal flaws. They're metals, okay? That means they're heavy. They're hard to carry around. They're also hard, right? Metals are hard. You can't just pinch off a piece of a gold bar when you want to buy something small. So they're hard, they're heavy, and because they're hard and they're heavy, it's hard to denominate them into smaller fractions. Yes, you can make coins, but then you've got to, in order to be good money, you've got to go the whole range from very small amounts to buy a piece of chewing gum to very large amounts to buy, a luxury house, right? So it has to cover all of those things. And like I said, with a gold bar, you can't just pinch off a piece to buy something small. So they're heavy, they're hard to denominate, and because of those reasons, it was hard to use them as money. You're walking around with a bag of coins. It's easy for somebody to hear you clinking, clink, 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 and then knock you on the head and steal your money, your gold. So, it was just difficult. So some bright person said, you know what? I will take all of your gold and store it in a safe place. I'll put it in a vault. I'll put guards around it, and then I'll give you a paper receipt for the amount of gold that I'm holding for you in my vault. And so people started taking these paper receipts and carrying those around, and in fact began to transact with those and to spend them with each other. And so money, paper money, began as receipts for gold that you had deposited for someone to hold. And so that holder became known as a bank or a banker. I don't know exactly when that happened, when the first bank arose. The first central bank was the Bank of England, which I think was chartered in like 1699 or something. So that's only a few hundred years ago where we started having the more sophisticated banking that we have today. So they haven't been around like a long time, a few hundred years. So anyway, that's where the banking got started was people would put their gold in the bank and then get receipts. And they could at any time, anytime they wanted, they could just go back to the bank with their receipts and say, give me my gold back. And the bank would give them their gold. But what people began to do was just to transact using the receipts because those are easy to carry, they're light, and they're also easy to denominate. I can give you a receipt for $1, $5, $10, $20, $100, whatever, right? So you can make different denominations. And so it had its advantages. The disadvantage was everything is centralized and controlled by a banker. Okay, so that's how banks got started. Now, central banking, as I said, got started with the Bank of England. And then in the United States, many of our founders saw the problems that was creating. And so they didn't want a central bank in America, but we got a central bank in 1913, as I said. So the Federal Reserve was created in 1913. So the dollar used to be a receipt for gold in the bank, and you could take your dollar, go to the bank, and turn in the dollar and receive gold in exchange. But in 1913, we had the central bank created, and with the Federal Reserve Act, and then it was only 20 years after that, okay, a mere 20 years, 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt, by executive order, right, a stroke of a pen, Executive Order 6102, confiscated everyone's gold, just stole it. You were literally required, legally required, if you had gold in your home, to turn in that gold to the government. Most people that had gold in their home probably didn't do that, but if you got caught, it was a $10,000 fine in 1933. It'd be like $1 million today. It was a $10,000 fine and up to 10 years in prison if you didn't. But the government didn't go around door to door collecting people's gold. They didn't have to because over 90% of the gold was in banks. And they simply went to the banks and said, hand over the gold. We're taking it. So believe it or not, in 1933, by an executive order of a president, all of the gold that belonged to the people was literally stolen. And that's when Fort Knox was built to house all of the gold that was stolen. Okay, so in 1933, the gold was stolen and the gold was collected and put into Fort Knox. Why did they do that? Well, because they wanted to, as long as the dollar was pegged to the gold, it was hard for the governments to spend money, without direct taxation. So one way a government can get money is to tax the people, direct taxation. But another way is to simply print the money. But if the money is pegged to a scarce metal like gold, it's hard to get away with doing that. So he confiscated the gold, and then they could begin to kind of stealthily print a little bit more money, more money than they had, actual gold in the vault. So the dollar is supposed to be a receipt for gold in the bank, but what they figured out they could do was hand out more receipts than they actually had gold. Includes fractional reserve lending, which is another rabbit hole. But in any case, now that they had the gold in their control, they could maybe print a little bit more money, and it was a little bit easier to do that. Also, this is important. In 1940s, in the 1930s and 1940s, we had World War II. And as the Allies in Europe were seriously concerned that they were going to lose to Germany, and that was a real possibility. Countries in Europe were falling to Germany left and right. So wisely, smartly, the countries of Europe sent their gold to the United States to be kept at Fort Knox, so that if England fell to the Germans, or when France fell to the Germans, at least the Germans wouldn't get their gold because they had sent their gold to America across the Atlantic Ocean to be safer. So we had not only all the gold of the American people in Fort Knox, but we had basically all the gold of Europe in Fort Knox because the Europeans had sent it here to keep it safe during the war. So as the war was winding down, of course, the war ended in 1945, but in 1944, there was something called the Bretton Woods Agreement. And so seeing that the war was ending and that the Allies in the United States were going to win this war, the United States was in a strong position to negotiate. And what we said at the Bretton Woods Agreement was, okay, we've got all your gold in Fort Knox. We're going to keep it there. And you guys are going to use the dollar for international trade. The dollar is going to become the world global reserve currency. So all the gold was kept in Fort Knox, and everybody else started using the dollar as the global reserve currency. This meant that we could still print more money. Now, what happens when you print more money? What happens is obviously that freshly printed money goes to the politicians so that they can spend it on their favorite programs, buying votes, fighting other wars, and things like that. But it ultimately leads to inflation. Printing money means you're inflating the money supply, and eventually that shows up as inflation of prices of goods and services. So the price of things will go up. The dollar is being debased, in other words, through this money printing. So in 1933, the gold was confiscated. By the 1940s, we had all the gold of Europe as well as the gold of America in Fort Knox. By the 1960s, okay, 1944 was Bretton Woods, and a mere 20 years later, right, by the 1960s, countries in Europe were beginning to figure out that the dollar was being debased and it was losing its purchasing power. And they said, you know what, we would just like to have our gold back. And in fact, maybe it was France, one of these nations sent warships to New York Harbor to get their gold back. That was in the 1960s, right? I think it was the late 1960s when the European nations said, hey, you know what, we'd kind of like to have our gold back. And it got to the point where, all of the European countries were starting to demand their gold back. Now, at this point, probably by the 1960s, all the gold was gone. Okay, Fort Knox has not been audited. It's had like minor audits, partial audits, but it has never really been audited. And in fact, the last time there was any audit at all was like 1970 or something like that. And even that was a partial audit. So my guess, and then Donald Trump has been trying to get Fort Knox audited, but how has that worked out? It hasn't. My guess is the gold is not there, right? And even by 1970, it was not there. It was gone. It was looted, right? So the bankers looted it, the politicians looted it, insiders looted it, but Fort Knox is probably empty. And so when these nations were demanding their gold back, well, it wasn't there, right, to give it back. So this is a crisis. And on August 15th, 1971, Richard Nixon said, you know what, we're just going to decouple the dollar from gold, and we're just going to break the connection between the dollar and the gold altogether. And you're not getting your gold back. Here's dollars instead, and you're just not going to get your gold. This was called the Nixon shock, and it was when we officially decoupled the dollar from gold. It's when the gold standard ended. 1/3 of Americans today, and it's 2026 right now as I record this, about 1/3 of Americans today still believe that the dollar is backed by gold. The dollar has not been backed by gold since August 15th, 1971. And that's when the dollar became officially fiat currency, which means it's not backed by anything. It's just by decree, by fiat. So that was in 1971. And then once the dollar was decoupled from gold, now the money printing can really ramp up. And it's been since 1971 that we've seen tremendous amounts of money printing. What we call the M2 money supply has grown now exponentially. Along with that, our national debt has grown exponentially. And the value of the dollar has dropped exponentially, is dropping more every day. The dollar has lost 98% of its value since the central bank was created in 1913. So basically, $1 is now 2 pennies, and pennies are so worthless they just stopped making them. So 98% of the value of the dollar's value has gone since 1913, and even since 2020. All right, just in the last 26 years, the value of the dollar has dropped about 50%. 50%. So basically everything costs twice as much now in 2026 as it did in the year 2000. And what we're see here is that the pace of the devaluation is accelerating. So this is how we got here. This is, a brief history of banking and why banks started, and the result of a central bank, fiat money, and unlimited money printing. Fortunately, there is a new money that's better than gold and better than silver and absolutely better than fiat paper money, and that is Bitcoin. And Bitcoin has the desirable properties of gold and silver and the other monetary metals in that it's scarce and it's durable. In fact, it's even more scarce. Gold, there's a lot of gold in the ground, right? There's a lot of gold. Gold is one of the most abundant atoms on planet Earth. So there's a lot of gold. So even though it's relatively scarce, it's not absolutely scarce in any practical sense. And when the demand for gold goes up, mining for gold goes up, and more gold is created. So, or more gold is mined, which is kind of like just printing money. So gold is not perfectly scarce, but Bitcoin is. Bitcoin is absolutely scarce. There's 21 million coins, and that's all there will ever be programmatically. It's durable because it's decentralized, and it's kind of like a hydra, right? You could take out one head, but there's 100 others. So there's no central place to bring it down or capture it. It's decentralized and it's perfectly scarce. It's also so it has those good qualities that the metals had, but it also doesn't have the disadvantages that the metals have. The metals were heavy. Well, Bitcoin is of course weightless. It's digital currency. It's not hard to store it. It's not hard to transport it. It's not hard to carry it around. It's infinitely it's digital, so you can divide it up any way you want to. So it's easily divisible, it's weightless, and it's easy to audit. In fact, it's being continuously audited. The nodes that are securing the Bitcoin network are also auditing every transaction to make sure it follows the rules and that Bitcoin is being kept scarce and all those sorts of things. Bitcoin has all the advantages that the monetary metals had, with none of the disadvantages. And Bitcoin really is the perfect money, practically speaking. If we could build our foundation, right, on Bitcoin, if we could move to a Bitcoin standard, that would solve 90% of our problems, because 90% of our problems, the economic problems, the political problems, the corruption, the societal decay, the social upheaval, as you get a separation of, the rich and the poor, which is a direct result of printing fiat money, the Cantillon effect. You can research these things on your own, but basically the wealth gap is a byproduct of fiat money. So if we were on a sound money standard, so many of our problems would go away. And Bitcoin is the answer. Bitcoin fixes all of these problems, which is why Bitcoiners say, fix the money, fix the world. That's my brief history of money and my very brief explanation as to why I think Bitcoin is better money. If you think this is interesting and want to learn more, then follow me on this channel, and let's keep going down this rabbit hole together. Until next time.